Hello, and welcome to the Geocurrents Lecture Series on the historical geography of natural psychoactive substances. This is the second half of a lecture on opium. I left off the first part of this lecture with this slide, rather arresting and distressing slide. The topic of this is the attempt by the government of China under the Qing Empire to crack down on opium in the early 1800s. Levels of addiction had become epidemic and intolerable social decay resulted. I'll read this brief quote from a Chinese official. At the beginning, opium smoking was confined to the fops of wealthy families. Later, people of all social strata, from government officials and members of the gentry to craftsmen, merchants, entertainers, servants, and even women, Buddhist monks and nuns, and Taoist priests took up the habit and openly bought and equipped themselves with smoking instruments. So this is something we've seen with a number of different drugs in this lecture series. They often begin at the upper echelons of society and then move downwards, although sometimes we have movement in the reverse. At any rate, China tried to prohibit opium corruption in this period, although they were thwarted. I had a slide in the previous lecture on the rebellions that had broken out in parts of central China, which made it very difficult to control. The other problem, though, was official corruption. In 1837, long after the rebellion was over, the government attempted to expel William Jardine of Jardine, Matheson and Company. This was one of the biggest opium selling firms, and other opium merchants as well. But Jardine is able to exploit his connections with corrupt officials. The order fails, and he remains. And note today the headquarters of Jardine Matheson Holding Limited in Hong Kong. So these drug merchants became highly influential, very wealthy, and very respectable, although that respectability must be questioned. Inspector Lin Zheju, was brought in by the government to shut down the opium trade. It had failed in so many different ways. So a particularly capable civil servant was brought in. Lin was considered to be unusually brilliant as a child, had studied foreign geography. In his official role, he sought the moral high ground, which would befit a scholar official of the Chinese empire, steeped in Confucian philosophy and literature. And he took a rigid hardline approach. Unfortunately, despite his learning, he was naive about British intentions and especially about British capabilities. It was very hard for people in China to keep up with the changing conditions in Europe, and particularly in the United Kingdom, where the Industrial Revolution was going strong and greatly increasing their offensive military capacity. Lin's big project was simply to, initial project I should say, was to destroy opium. And he did indeed that, 1,000 tons. The Chinese Museum has actually made a model of this episode of destroying big casks of opium. So to read, a description: a pit was dug, filled with opium, mixed with brine, and then lime was thrown in, so this highly alkaline substance, forming a scalding furnace which made a kind of boiling soup of the opium. In the evening, the mixture was let out by sluices and allowed to flow out to sea with the ebb tide. One can only wonder what it did to the marine fauna in the area. Well, the British, as one could imagine, are infuriated and they demand compensation. China refuses, and Britain declares war. The first Opium War fought between 1839 and 1842. It was a bit difficult for the British initially, but they soon got the upper hand and won a devastating victory over the Chinese. You could just look at the comparison of the casualties on the two sides. You could see the Chinese greatly outnumbered the British in terms of their total troops, but the British had much better equipment. And note that they're relying on their Indian army as much as on the British army. One of the things that really gave the British an advantage was a new class of shallow draft steamships. So steamships were just coming in. You could see The ship has both a steam engine and sails, but the shallow draft was very important because it meant that they could go up into rivers and not just harass the Chinese along the coast. They had powerful guns. They were able to take out Chinese naval defense systems and go on to victory. So you could see here in the description, the ship Nemesis, aptly named, was deployed to China, arriving in 1840 and used to great effect. And the Chinese referred to this ship as a devil ship because it was so instrumental in that war. So the Qing Empire of China has to sign a humiliating treaty, the Treaty of Nanking, basically forced on them. China has to pay a large indemnity to the United Kingdom. They cede Hong Kong directly to the United Kingdom. The era of managed trade, which had existed for many centuries, where China had previously only allowed trade with the outer world, certainly with the Europeans, through one city, Guangzhou in the far south, very close to Hong Kong, by the way. That comes to an end. The British demand that 5 treaty ports be open to their merchants. And a year later, British officials get extraterritoriality, meaning if they commit a crime in China, they will be tried in a British court, not a Chinese court. So this is a real assault on Chinese sovereignty. The map shows treaty ports opened in the first Opium War. You could see concentrated in the central and southern coast. And there's a second Opium War I'll talk about in a few minutes, 1856 to 1860. This time other Western countries join the United Kingdom, and a large number of other treaty ports are open, many of them well inland, where European and American merchants as well by this time are able to trade as they will with little Chinese interference. China at this time is undergoing catastrophic decline. The biggest issue here probably was the Taiping Rebellion. I've talked before about the White Lotus Rebellion, but the Taiping Rebellion is more devastating. 20 to 30 million dead, sometimes considered the 4th deadliest war in world history, although it's hard to get numbers on this. The map is really important, which shows the area where the Taiping rebels were most active. And you can see the dark brown areas in the central coast. That is the area that is today both north and south of Shanghai. It was then, and it is today, the economic and cultural core of China. Yeah, the capital city was much further north in Beijing, and the Europeans had been trading in the far south, which was important as well. But this is the traditional core, and the fact that the Taiping rebels, well, you can just see how long that war was, 1850 to 1864. So eventually the rebels are defeated, but it's not difficult. I mean, it's not easy at all. It's extraordinarily difficult and expensive, and a tremendous amount of damage was done. You can see the illustration here is Wikipedia illustration is labeled as part of the century of humiliation. And that is the century basically from the first Opium War all the way through World War II, when China, which had been in the 18th century the largest and most economically powerful state in the world, becomes a sort of hollowed out pawn. And this is something that figures very prominently in Chinese historical imagination and geopolitical thinking. The second Opium War, you can see, lasted 4 years. If you look in that center column at the bottom, you could see that France and the United States and Russia were involved, not as much as the United Kingdom. This war begins after China seizes a British ship suspected of piracy. And Britain is not at all happy with that. I won't go into the details, but the Western powers are victorious. Afterwards, all China is open to British and other foreign merchants. Foreign imports are exempt from internal transit duties. And this end of this war really marks the effective end of Chinese sovereignty, or at least full sovereignty. And it was entailed a lot of just utter humiliation, such as the looting of the summer palace of the emperor of the Manchu dynasty. You can see by Anglo-French forces just taking out all of the goods and riches entirely unnecessary, but humiliating in many ways. China even loses territory. Mostly the Europeans do not want to divide up China into separate colonial territories. Rather, what they want is a very weak Chinese state that has nominal authority but gives free range for European merchants and others to do what they will. But Russia did extract at this time what was formerly known as Outer Manchuria, now the Russian Far East, including the city of Vladivostok, and other territories were being hived off, some a bit earlier, some a bit later. So China today is significantly smaller than it had been. Also, you don't see on the map Mongolia, which was then part of the Qing Empire, Manchu-led Chinese Empire, and it doesn't. Mongolia or Outer Mongolia doesn't become independent till the end of the empire around 1911, 1912. So we saw this graph in a truncated form previously. The point is opium imports continue to surge. So you can look at in 1839 at the beginning of the First Opium War and then compare that to the period right after the Second Opium War and on up to 1880. It just continues to increase at close to an exponential rate. The U.S. is involved. Like I said, they're involved in the Second Opium War. There was already a large U.S. presence in Canton or Guangzhou, which in far southern China, which had been the one Chinese city open to Western trade before the First Opium War. So you could see the gardens of the American factory. Factory doesn't mean, in this sense, doesn't mean what we think of a factory today. A factory was basically a trading or merchant outpost. It wasn't an area of making industrial goods by any means, but you could see how large and elaborate it was. And there's increasing evidence among historians of the United States, emphasis, I should say, of historians of the United States on American merchants making huge profits in the opium trade. Now, they weren't able to go to India to buy opium, but opium was being produced in Turkey in fairly large quantities. So the American merchants discovered that they could sail to the Ottoman Empire, as it was then, and buy high-quality opium and then take it to China and sell it. You can see an illustration from an article called Merchants of Addiction, which is appropriate. And it's titled The Blue-Blooded Families That Made Fortunes in the Opium Trade. And we can see some individuals here from very well-known families, or in the case of Washington Irving, quite well-known himself. Warren Delano, probably have heard of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, so Delano was in his maternal family line. Or here's an article from the Harvard Crimson, a few years back on opulence and opium, the legacy of Harvard's drug syndicate. Sort of coming to terms with this legacy. And it wasn't just Harvard, other universities, Columbia, Princeton, had this connection between wealthy families that endowed or gave money to these universities and the opium trade. To quote from it, in The Imperial Cruise, A Secret History of Empire and War, historian James Bradley shows that many of Boston's elite families, Cabot, Lowell, Kirkland included, sustained their wealth through the opium trade. So these are some of the families of what were once called the Boston Brahmins, this very elite group, economically important, culturally and intellectually important, and politically important as well. I'm going to move on now today from opium per se, more to morphine. Now, morphine is an alkaloid found in opium latex. Heroin is derived from morphine. These are both called opiates. The pie chart here is it's a little bit misleading. I mean, it's accurate enough, but you can see opiates come from the opium plant itself. Morphine and codeine are in the latex. Heroin is derived from it. Opioids have similar chemistry, but they are simply made in the lab. They are not derived from opium, and that includes oxycodone, fentanyl being the biggest problem these days. So some medicinal products, well, all of them initially were medicinal, but fentanyl now is the leading cause of overdose deaths and health damage in general from opiates or opioids. Friedrich Zerturner was a German chemist, as I think I mentioned before. In the 19th century, Germany was the leading center of chemistry. They really not only developed it as an intellectual endeavor, but also commercialized it and were the first really to do so. And there was a lot of interest in psychoactive substances. I talked before about cocaine being isolated from the coca plant. But in 1804, quite early, morphine was identified as the active drug ingredient. Now, it's not the only one. There's codeine in there as well. So Turner experimented on dogs and on himself. He claimed that he had found a substance that was more potent than opium, absolutely true, but he thought that meant that it would be less addictive. He didn't have to use as much to address the pain problem. But guess what? He became addicted himself. But he was very important in the development of alkaloid chemistry, which is an extremely important branch of the field. Heroin was created quite a few decades later, late 1800s, simply by altering morphine. And again, it was thought to be less addictive, partly because it was a better pain reliever. The term heroin comes from the idea that it was a heroic drug. And we could see here Bayer Company selling here, a German firm but a multinational one selling, aspirin and heroin, a sedative for coughs, and another heroin product here. A little bit earlier, though, before heroin was invented, morphine was used massively in the U.S. Civil War. No surprise. You look at scenes of hospitals, amputations, and the like. It was a very devastating war, tremendous amount of injury and damage, and doctors and nurses turned to morphine extensively. And again, quite understandable. It's a pain reliever, and just to quote from this article, gardens in both the North and South were ablaze with poppies as citizens patriotically grew opium for the troops, and they were pushed to do this by their governments. The raw drug was processed into morphine and rushed to the front. Millions of doses were given. Thousands of veterans with lifelong wounds were taught to use syringes to self-administer the drug long after the war ended. Morphine and syringes were sold by mail order and over the counter. And again, I don't want to be critical of this. The tremendous amount of pain was relieved and misery abated. On the other hand, a lot of people became addicts. Now, it's very important to note that most people who are given large quantities of morphine after they've had a horrific accident or war injury or something causing pain, most people are able to quit using it relatively easy. Some go cold turkey, although that comes with illness-like syndrome. More people just gradually curtail their use and are fine. A certain percentage, and it's hard to say exactly what that percentage is. It's not huge, but it's not inconsiderable. But a certain percentage of people, for whatever reason, I'm not going to go into the psychology of it, but for whatever reason, are not able or have a very difficult time reducing, let alone quitting their drug intake. And so you get a lot of persisting addiction. One of the problems after the Civil War was that there wasn't much sympathy for these people who did become addicted. So to quote from this article, not only was opiate addiction dangerous and unhealthy, resulting in thousands of overdose deaths from the 1860s to the early 20th century, but the condition was deeply stigmatized in Civil War America. Most Americans considered addiction to be an unmanly and immoral vice. Addicted veterans deserved punishment, not sympathy, according to many contemporary observers. Consequently, addicted veterans faced terrible outcomes. Well, that's not unique to the United States, and it's certainly not unique to the Civil War era. A fascinating little side note is that during the Civil War, people were growing opium all over the country and were encouraged to do so. But after that, the only group in the U.S. that was able to profitably grow and process opium were the Shakers. Remember, opium is very labor intensive, and it takes a lot of skilled and specialized knowledge and techniques. And basically, U.S. opium producers were not able to compete with producers in places like the Ottoman Empire or India. But the Shakers could. Now, who are the Shakers? The Shakers were a radical millenarian Christian sect. Millenarian meaning they think the second coming is going to happen very quickly. They were moderately influential in certain areas of the country in the 19th century. They attracted converts, economically egalitarian, socialistic in their ways of living economically and with other people, gender egalitarian, quite unusual at the time, pacifists, also celibate, did not believe in marriage or sexual reproduction. They could only maintain their sect by bringing in new people and practice very simple living. They're known for the furniture that they made. Shaker furniture, simple but durable and elegant, is widely collected to this day. But they also, probably more importantly, grew medicinal plants and made medicines. Note, though, the total population of the Shaker community in 2023, 2, and they're elderly, so it is a faith that is dying out. Difficult to maintain a faith where everyone is supposed to be celibate. Shakers and Opium. I'm going to quote from a book called Opium, How an Ancient Flower Shaped and Poisoned Our World. But to quote from it, the crop was an important part of the Shaker culture as well as finances. Shaker women collected the opium sap the same way Middle Eastern farmers had been doing it for centuries. In 1906, Sister Marcia Bullard waxed eloquently about her memories of the white-capped sisters stooping among the blossoms to score those pods from which the petals had just fallen. Well, the poppy fields are beautiful when they're in flower. It's pretty grueling and difficult work, but evidently Sister Bullard found it satisfying. So the post-Civil War crisis of addiction peaked in 1896, or at least the consumption of opium did, 500,000 pounds per year. Afterward, there is a decline, and this is concomitant with state and local regulations and labeling demands from the U.S. federal government through the Pure Food and Drug Act, and later the Harrison Narcotics Act and other official measures, both at the federal and state levels. 1911, it was estimated there were 250,000 addicts, and interestingly, 2/3 to 3/4 were women. As I think I mentioned before, with laudanum, opiates were widely used for menstrual cramps and other female issues. It's sometimes said that the first anti-drug law in the U.S. was in San Francisco in earlier 1875, where it became a misdemeanor, and only a misdemeanor, to operate or enter an opium den. Now, before the progressive era of the late 1800s and early 1900s, the government basically had a hands-off, laissez-faire attitude towards drug use. That really changes in the first half of the 20th century. We'll see that a lot when we talk about cannabis. But anyway, this first effort to outlaw opium was also an anti-Chinese effort. San Francisco had a very large, densely populated area called Chinatown, Chinese community. And to quote this article, in the 1880s and 1890s, local laws of ever-increasing severity attempted to stop the flow of opium and prohibited Americans from visiting opium dens. San Francisco's reputation as America's capital of opium debauchery, well, that's partly because San Francisco's location on the Pacific Ocean, its large Chinese community, and its engagement in trade with East Asia. But anyway, San Francisco's reputation stimulated city authorities to take at least cosmetic steps. A handful of Americans were jailed, And by the late 1890s, the laws grew more severe. Fewer and fewer Americans visited the opium dens. The hysteria that led to the no whites in the opium dens law was stimulated by lurid tales about white girls being forced into wild, opium-fueled orgies. I doubt if there were opium-fueled orgies, more like opium-fueled sessions of people zoning out. But anyway, in the Progressive Era, there were a lot of official acts, both at the federal and state level. I mentioned the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914, which was very important in curtailing cocaine use, but it also strictly regulated and taxed opiates and made it illegal to prescribe morphine or any other opiates to an addict. Also led, though, to the emergence of a black market. I'll move on now to talk a little bit about the development of global opium trade network. It's a map showing illicit opium cultivation. It's kind of hard to see. Excuse me. In 1989, I just put it in there partly to show the global nature of it, although interestingly, this map is not showing any flow into the Soviet Union or into South America. Undoubtedly incorrect. And certainly after the downfall of the Soviet Union, Russia becomes an area with a lot of opiate addiction. This is a map showing more of a current day flow pattern. We can see here a few areas with a lot of opium poppy production. Mexico, I have a map of that later on. Colombia. More important, Afghanistan, although as we'll see that has opium production has decreased in the last few years in Afghanistan. And then the northern part of Southeast Asia, particularly northern Myanmar or Burma. So let me focus first on that area, sometimes called the Golden Triangle. Golden after the amount of money that comes in from the drug trade. Initially opium, then morphine and heroin, and now including synthetic opioids. But this is a mountainous region, historically mostly populated by small-scale societies or tribal peoples, and it's long had an opium growing practice. Quite recently, and you can see this is from January 2023, the BBC reports that opium production in Myanmar or Burma surges to a 9-year high, and they have some information just on the period from 2021 to 2023, from 423 metric tons to over 1,000 metric tons in just a couple of years. So this is an area that has long been noted for opium production. Was the world center of opium production in the 1970s, 1980s, and so on. So you have to wonder about why this current surge. Well, there's two things that have gone on. One was opium decline in Afghanistan, and that's especially after the Taliban radical Islamist group comes back into power, which was 2021. And they start to stomp down on opium growing. The other is the military coup in Burma or Myanmar and a resurgence of civil war. Of course, beyond this, a really important thing to note is how large the profits can be. And one way to look at this is the increase in price as you go from raw opium in Shan State of Burma or Myanmar at $120 to $200 per kilogram, and then just see the price as it goes up. Of course, there's a lot of processing in between and transporting, but profits are obviously huge. But as I mentioned before, in 2021, there was another military coup in Burma. Burma's been mostly under military or quasi-military rule, at least since 1961. So it looked like they were moving into civil governance under the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi. She was deposed again by a general. And as that happened, Burma went into a economic crisis and also a political crisis. Burma has long had a lot of ethnic rebellions. Those rebellions intensified, they resurged, plus you have a lot of ethnic Burmans, the dominant group of the population, also resisting and fighting against military rule. So Burma, like I say, has been noted since its independence in 1948 with ethnic conflict. About 2/3 of the people are ethnic Burmans. 1/3 are members of minority groups. The minority groups resist and resent domination by the Burmese speaker Burmans, and so have periodically been in rebellion. The map shows 1995 to present, but really it would be 1948 to present. They've never disappeared, and you can see most of the states of Burma either had or have ongoing insurgency. The map on the right just shows some of the insurgent groups fighting in the, I believe that map was late 20th century or maybe early 21st, but it's just giving some of the militant or insurgent groups, most of which are associated with a particular ethnic group. Now, when you have these sort of insurgencies, you have to finance them. So I talked in the lecture on coca and cocaine about the FARC, a left-wing militant group trying to overthrow Colombia, at least initially, and financing that through the cocaine trade. So opium has been the most important way that most of these rebellions in Burma and a lot of neighboring countries have been financed as well. There's one place in particular that is now the world's opium capital. It was in the 1980s. It was supplanted by Afghanistan. Now it is again. It's called the Shan State. It's a plateau, somewhat mountainous area. The people, most of the people who live there are members of the Shan ethnic group. They're much closer to the Thai. They speak a Thai language, so they're much closer to the Thai of Thailand than to the Burmans of Burma. And they've long resented Burmese rule. In the 1980s, they had their own narco state, which was effectively independent. Eventually, Burma figured out how to defeat them by allying with other ethnic groups and actually giving those other ethnic groups carte blanche to engage in drug manufacturing or opium growing and processing. It looks like now Burma might be losing the war. The map on the left shows the areas that the government controlled at the time of the coup, all the areas in pink, and then it shows the areas under Burmese government control in late 2023. These wars, because there are actually a number of these ethnic insurgencies in Burma, are, in my opinion, grossly underreported in the U.S. media. This is a bitter and nasty struggle with tremendous human costs and environmental damage, and it's generally ignored. But it is involved in the surge of opium production. In the 1960s, late 1960s, and into the early 1970s, the U.S. CIA was involved in organizing and supplying anti-communist rebels in Laos. So Laos was involved in the Vietnam War. A lot of the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail that took military goods and fighters from North Vietnam to South Vietnam passed through Laos. That's a very mountainous country, a lot of tribal people again. And the CIA was, when the U.S. tried to sort of hide its involvement in Laos, it wasn't so much officially part of the Vietnam War, but it was highly involved. And so the CIA went mostly into tribal communities like the Hmong, H-M-O-N-G, a tribal group that were anti-communist, or at least opposed to communist forces. And they fought with the CIA, under CIA involvement. And then after the communist triumph in 1975, a lot of Hmong came to the United States, were brought in. But the CIA was organizing this and It was funding it mostly through opium and heroin trade. So Alfred McCoy, a very brave scholar, long taught, must be retired by now, but long taught at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, wrote some very important books, and one was The Politics of Heroin, CIA Complicity in the Global Drug Trade. He definitely got into some trouble for that. But anyway, this surge of opium growing and heroin production actually led to a huge heroin market in South Vietnam, to a lot of addiction among U.S. troops in South Vietnam, and to a tremendous loss of morale. So in the long term, it was probably not the wisest decision. So Afghanistan had really moved into opium growing. They had been doing it for a long time, but it was greatly increased in the late 20th century, early 21st century. You could see as recently as 2018 on that graph that Afghanistan was producing about more than 3/4 of the world's total opium crop. In Myanmar or Burma, significantly less. Myanmar was about the same as Mexico at that time, and the rest of the world not that much. The map on the right just shows some of the opium poppy cultivation zones of Afghanistan. It's not the whole country, but it's most of it. Official statistics are somewhat suspect, but what they do show is a lot of ups and downs of opium production in Afghanistan. You can see when the Taliban first came to power in the year 2000, they proclaimed that opium was prohibited under Islamic law and did their best to shut it down, and were very successful. After the Taliban was thrown out of power by local forces in combination with the United States at the end of 2001, opium production surged again to even higher levels than it had been, at least in many years. So now the Taliban is back in power, and again they're trying to eliminate opium production, and it looks like they've been quite successful, at least for now. We'll have to see what will happen. Here's an article claiming that opium supplies dropped 95% after the Taliban drug ban. And the Taliban certainly is noted for its brutality and willingness to do what it thinks it has to do to propel its own agenda. It would be very interesting to see some good reporting on what's happening in formerly opium-producing villages in Afghanistan, but I have not seen anything like that. Afghanistan was recently the main opium and heroin supplier for Russia and Europe, and like I say, those are big markets, both of them. Mexico, however, has been a more important supplier of heroin to the United States for some time. Opium cultivation there began as early as the 1940s, but really boomed after NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Act. That made it much easier to smuggle across the border, and it also resulted in, at least in parts of Mexico, in a lot of agricultural unemployment, as small-scale corn or maize farmers were not able to compete with much larger American farms. So Mexican farms producing specialty crops like fruits and vegetables thrived, be able to export to the U.S., but those producing staple crops didn't do so well. So there was an increase in unemployment. Also very important was Mexico formerly produced most of the marijuana or cannabis for the United States. It produced quite low-quality cannabis back in the 1970s, 60s, and 70s. When I was young, most marijuana came to the United States from Mexico, particularly Sinaloa in the northwestern part of the country. But that was low quality. Other countries, Panama, Colombia, Thailand, started producing higher quality, and then farmers in the United States harm higher quality still, which really undermined the Mexican market. And evidently there was a move to opium. So this map shows opium producing areas of Mexico. The one in the north there, that would be the state of Sinaloa, and then into neighboring states like Durango and Chihuahua, and then some in the south as well. As far as the global market goes, this is just opiates, not opioids. So in other words, we're just talking about opium, morphine, and heroin here, the natural products, if you will, although heroin is not exactly natural. But Afghanistan, interestingly, this is 2015, was the world's largest producer, but also the largest consumption. It's still, 3.5% of the population is not overwhelming by any means, but that is a large market. And it's very interesting that it was Afghanistan, Iran, and Russia at the top of the chart, and then some much smaller countries. Yeah, Ukraine is in there as well, but the United States at a very high level, to the extent that this is accurate, quite a bit higher than Myanmar or Burma there at the bottom. At any rate, despite all of this, it's really important to note that as prevalent as heroin is, and it's mostly heroin that I've been talking about in this recent part of the lecture, as prevalent as and devastating as heroin is, it's now far overshadowed by synthetic opioids. And one good way to get a sense of this is look at the overdose deaths, which is this is pretty good data. It's pretty hard to hide overdose deaths, so they usually come to attention. And you could see that heroin had a much larger position in that chart. But after about 2015, it was the synthetic opioids, primarily fentanyl, which then came to dominate. So the thing about fentanyl is it's just extraordinarily potent, and the gap between an effective dose and a lethal dose is relatively small. So it is very easy for people to overdose. And if you didn't have these synthetic opioid derivatives that block the opiate receptors in the brain, you would have actually far higher rates, because a lot of people's lives are saved by injections of those substances. So fentanyl, which was originally derived for legitimate medical purposes, though has become a very devastating epidemic. Looking at overdose patterns, this claims just to be for opioids, basically fentanyl, as percentage of the U.S. population. You see some kind of confusing patterns here. In the West, it's mostly rural counties, small population counties. In California, for example, Tuolumne County, Lake County, Plumas, all of these are hilly, mountainous places with relatively rural and low population, relatively poor in all cases. And that's true over most of the West. If you look at New England, though, you see very high levels of deaths in very affluent areas of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. The worst area overall, though, is a non-affluent area. That would be the Appalachian area of West Virginia, many parts of Kentucky, southern Ohio. So these are areas of relatively low income and a lot of problems from population loss, and certainly in West Virginia, most of the coal mining industry. So a lot of economic dislocation, distress, poverty. Fentanyl is relatively cheap. You can overdose and kill yourself without having to spend a lot of money. Interesting that much slower rates across much of the Deep South, from Alabama through Mississippi, Louisiana, southern Arkansas into Texas, quite low. Very low in most of the Great Plains, with a few exceptions, which would be interesting to talk about, but I feel I don't have the time to go into that. And instead, I'll conclude this lecture by just making a few remarks. One thing that I find really interesting about opium and opiates like morphine and heroin, and opioids like fentanyl to some extent, is they exemplify what I think is a central drug paradox. I should say psychoactive drugs paradox, is many of these substances can be extraordinarily beneficial and extraordinarily damaging. And opium and its derivatives and analogs, yes, is extraordinarily beneficial. I mean, really, nothing beats it for for pain relief, and pain relief is a huge issue. It's interesting. I find that I think there's a very common view that before modern medicine, uh, surgery, say an amputation, was just a time for extraordinary pain. The person just had to, bite a leather strap as they sawed off their arm. But in actuality, going all the way back to ancient Greece, people would be treated with opium, and often with something like mandrake as well, to put themselves in a sort of a position of almost amnesia, or something similar to a twilight sleep sort of thing. Now, opium later was reduced in use in medieval Europe, but it was certainly known in Renaissance, early modern period, used medicinally in the Muslim realm, and used in China, used in much of the world. And yes, can be very effective pain relief. And that would be both for acute situations, like an amputation, but also for chronic issues. And there is a lot of evidence that as the population ages, we're undergoing a chronic pain epidemic. There are a lot of people who are living with pain all the time. And that's why you started to get the development. That's why heroin was developed originally. And it was why things like fentanyl have been developed to try to deal with this. When I gave this talk, this lecture to Stanford continuing study students in the spring of 2024, I had the advantage of being able to engage in question and answers, give and take, after the end of the lecture. And there was a member of the class from the United Kingdom who said, in Britain, heroin is legal. It's only legal in hospital settings. They call it something else, but it is heroin, and it is more effective at controlling pain than morphine. And a lot of people find that very advantageous. And he was claiming that the United States should never have put heroin in the Schedule 1 of the narcotic schedule, meaning that it has no legitimate uses whatsoever. He said it does have legitimate uses. But of course, the problem is, how do you keep something that has legitimate uses out of public use as a recreational drug, where it can result in incredible devastation, addiction, overdose, death, and so on? Well, it's not easy to find the right balance. There are no more drugs, no drugs that are more deadly or destructive than fentanyl, but yet that doesn't mean that it was created by evil scientists wanting to destroy the world. No, there were people concerned about pain and pain relief and pain management. So it's very difficult to find the right balance. And then finally, opium, and let's just stick with opium, and the other related drugs. They just have they really show the potential of psychoactive drugs for economic and geopolitical ramifications. What is more important in the history of the 19th century than China's century of humiliation, the Opium Wars, China being basically divvied up among Western powers? So much of what is happening today with the resurgence of China and its often somewhat bellicose attitude and hostility often towards the West, a lot of this is tied up in this century of humiliation, which is certainly something China has not got over. And to a certain extent, China is returning to the economic and geopolitical position that it once occupied before its century of humiliation. And you cannot understand that century of humiliation without understanding the opium trade, which is also tied to the tea trade. And then today, looking at Afghanistan, I could have talked more about radical Islamist networks and funding that through drug trade, situation in Burma or Myanmar. All of these are really important, something that we should probably pay more attention to than we do. And when we pay attention to them, we find that psychoactive drugs lie right at the core. So this just reiterate my central point in this course. is that I think we as academics, as teachers, should spend more attention on the subject, which has often been ignored or trivialized in one way or another. So thank you. The next lecture will be on cannabis or marijuana. Well, again, there'll be a couple of lectures on that topic. Thank you.